This is not a bedtime story. This is a true chronicle of a ghost nation, a terrifying deep dive into the absolute worst place you could possibly be born in Anglo-Saxon England. We are talking about the Forgotten Kingdom, the realm that was so utterly humiliated and systematically erased from the records by its powerful neighbors, that historians still argue over the names of its own kings.
Can you believe there was an entire sovereign state, born of ancient blood and fire, that existed for 300 brutal years, yet its legacy was deliberately scrubbed clean, leaving behind nothing but whispers in the mud of the Thames?
A catastrophe no one saw coming, perhaps because they were too busy looking at the colossal powers of Mercia and Wessex to notice the silent, fatal decay happening right at their core. Welcome, my friends, to the deep, dark, and utterly spectacular history of the East Saxons, the Kingdom of Essex. Imagine existing on a constant, vibrating knife edge, where every single day was defined by the crushing, inevitable weight of conquest. Your royal lineage was magnificent, supposedly tracing its descent back to the mighty god Woden himself. But your borders were made of shifting river reeds and deep, unforgiving forests, not stone fortifications. To the north, you felt the cold breath of East Anglia, and to the west, the monstrous power of the Mercian Empire, ruled by kings who literally drank the blood of their enemies and demanded absolute, humiliating subjugation. Every dawn, the King of Essex did not look out at a stable domain. He looked out at 3 hostile superpowers circling him like sharks sensing blood in the water. They were not masters of their own destiny. They were simply the most valuable and tragically vulnerable piece on the great Anglo-Saxon chessboard, perpetually waiting for the final, devastating move. The geography of Essex was its greatest blessing and its ultimate curse. It held the economic keys to the entire island, controlling the ancient Roman metropolis of Londinium, the beating heart of trade and wealth in Britannia. They were rich beyond comprehension, a shimmering beacon of gold and resources, yet they were eternally, fatally weak. Wealth attracts vultures, and their position, sandwiched between these 3 hostile giants, made them the perfect, ripe target for every ambitious warlord with a thirst for gold and a blade sharpened for conquest. For centuries, the wealth that flowed into Londinium was simply a temptation, a down payment on their own eventual destruction, paid out in the slow, agonizing currency of political humiliation and forced treaties. Our chronicle begins not with a glorious trumpet blast, but with a whisper echoing out of the deep, dark forests of the 6th century, right after the withdrawal of Rome left a power vacuum filled by chaos and bloodlust. The traditional founder, S-Queen, a man so shrouded in myth we barely know if he existed outside of genealogical propaganda, carved out a desperate foothold in the unforgiving eastern marshlands. This was an act of audacious defiance, a signal fire lit in the ruins of civilization, daring the other Saxon lords to challenge him for this prime yet perilous territory. He established a dynasty, the Scaefingas, built on the sheer audacity of existing in a space where logic dictated they should have been immediately swallowed by their larger, more brutal cousins. But the true gut-wrenching drama, the insidious poison that tore the kingdom apart from the inside, was the collision of the gods themselves. Can you imagine a kingdom that converted wholeheartedly to the new Roman faith of Christianity, only to have its king die and his 3 utterly pagan sons immediately seize the throne, expel the priests, smash the altars, and force the entire population back into the ancient bloody rites? This was not a slow spiritual transition. It was a violent religious whiplash, a political seizure that happened not once but repeatedly, leaving the people of Essex spiritually fractured and politically unstable in the eyes of everyone else. They became the ultimate flip-floppers, seen as untrustworthy and weak by the rising Christian powers of Kent and Wessex, and as apostates by the hard-line pagan warriors of Mercia. This internal fracture, this constant, violent battle for the soul of the nation, was the crack that their enemies, especially the monstrous Mercian kings, would relentlessly exploit for centuries, bleeding the East Saxons dry until nothing was left but a historical footnote. We are about to dive into the forgotten nightmares of a kingdom that defied fate, embraced unimaginable wealth, fought against giants, and ultimately was swallowed whole by the political shadows it could never escape. Get comfortable, because the fog is just beginning to lift over the marshlands. The marshlands finally coalesced, not into solid ground, but into a fiercely independent territory ruled by the East Sayax, the East Saxons. Who was their founding father? The records are so thin they barely register, suggesting a shadowy figure named Asquine, or perhaps Sleda, both kings lost to the historical vacuum, known only through murky genealogies that stretch back into the mud and mist. These initial rulers found themselves clinging to the eastern shores, geographically defined and fatally flawed, their heartlands wrapped around London, but their true defense was the impenetrable, mosquito-ridden swamp of the Thames estuary itself. They were a shield carved from fragile wood, constantly under pressure from the might of Mercia to the west. This early period, often called the Age of Shadow, was defined by a single, terrifying truth. Essex was a geopolitical hostage, a buffer state meant to absorb the shockwaves of neighboring giants, and its existence was conditional on the whims of those far greater than itself. But the first real moment of documented destiny for Essex didn't come from within. It came from the towering, terrifying power of their southern neighbor, the undisputed giant of the late 6th century, Kent. King Ethelbert of Kent, married to a Christian Frankish princess, was the supreme overlord, the Bretwalda, and he viewed Essex as little more than a necessary extension of his own massive sphere of influence. This is where the story shifts from mere settlement to existential threat, because Ethelbert decided that if he controlled the land, he would also control the very souls of its people, forcing his nephew, King Sigeberht of Essex, onto the stage of world history. Sigeberht, a man caught between ancestral loyalty to the old gods and the crushing political necessity of pleasing his powerful uncle, made the monumental, defining decision that would haunt Essex for the next 100 years: conversion. He chose political expediency over traditional faith, a choice that would inevitably lead to bloodshed and chaos. In 604 AD, the missionary Mellitus, fresh from Rome and armed with the authority of Pope Gregory the Great, arrived to establish the fledgling bishopric of London, the very heart of the East Saxon domain. The speed of this shift was dizzying. Sigeberht allowed the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral, a monumental testament to the new faith, built right over the ancient pagan heart of the city, a power move designed to demonstrate subservience to Kent and alliance with Rome, fundamentally altering the landscape of power in the region. Imagine the tension in the royal hall. The old thanes, their beards braided with the symbols of Woden and Thor, watching their king kneel to a foreign god, whose symbols were weakness and suffering, not strength and battle fury. This was a fragile piece, purchased at the cost of cultural heritage, maintained only by the iron fist of Kent. Then, in a horrific twist of fate that proved just how dependent the Christian mission was on external political scaffolding, Sigeberht died. The year was perhaps 616 AD, and the moment the Christian king's breath left his body, the whole precarious structure of the new faith shattered like cheap glass, plunging the kingdom back into the terrifying familiar comfort of the old ways. Sigeberht had 3 sons, Siward, Sexred, and another shadowy brother, who immediately seized power, and they were not interested in forgiveness or turning the other cheek. They were fierce, proud, and absolutely loyal to the blood of their fathers and the rage of the old gods, seeing the Christian presence as an unwanted invasion. Their first act, the immediate and violent reversal of their father's disastrous policy. Mellitus, the Bishop of London, the representative of the mighty Roman Church, was suddenly staring down the barrels of 3 furious pagan kings who demanded he flee the kingdom immediately or face a gruesome end. The Venerable Bede, our chief chronicler, recounts a legendary exchange that perfectly captures the barbaric contempt the sons held for the imported faith, a scene dripping with historical irony and cultural collision. The brothers saw Mellitus distributing the consecrated bread, the Eucharist, and, misunderstanding the ritual completely, demanded he give them some of the white bread he had given their father, believing it held some magical, temporal power. When Mellitus explained that they must be baptized first to receive the sacrament, the king scoffed, refusing the spiritual cleansing, viewing the act as a degrading submission to foreign dominance. Then came the chilling ultimatum that defined the next generation of Essex history. If you cannot supply us with the life-giving bread, then you cannot stay here.
Mellitus was summarily banished, forced to flee for his life back to Kent, and ultimately across the sea to Gaul, leaving London and all of Essex to plunge back into the terrifying darkness of heathenism, a definitive rejection of external control.
This was not just a religious reversion. It was a declaration of war against Kentish and Mercian domination, a desperate, fatalistic grasp at sovereignty that simultaneously guaranteed their utter political isolation. The East Saxons had purchased a brief, bloody moment of independence, but the price was steep. They were now utterly alone, having cast off the primary superpower alliance of their age, choosing pride over protection. The history books close their pages on Essex for a long, painful generation.
They vanished back into the fog, victims of their own defiant, short-sighted rage, leaving behind only the echo of pagan shouts in the silent, empty ruins of St. Paul's, a monument abandoned before the mortar had even dried.
This was the first great historical trauma, the original sin of the kingdom. Every time they tried to reach for stability through external alliances, internal conflict and the overwhelming shadow of their neighbors dragged them back into the marsh, guaranteeing their obscurity. The struggle for the soul of the East Saxons was destined to be a horrifying cycle of hope, submission, and bloody, defiant collapse.
The stench of failure clung to the mudflats of Essex, following the first catastrophic Christian mission. King Sigeberht was gone, the priests were expelled, and the kingdom had violently reverted to the old whispering idols of the marsh and the terrifying, localized gods of blood and earth. For decades, the flame of Christian hope seemed entirely extinguished, drowned by pagan defiance and the raw, brutal political necessities of simply surviving the Anglo-Saxon storm.
The East Saxons were once again a historical footnote, a backwater lost to the documentation of the great monasteries. But obscurity in this era was not safety. It was merely the calm before the next inevitable wave of destructive influence. The relentless pressure never ceased, and the necessity for political stabilization, which often meant alignment with the dominant religion, grew stronger every year. Around the 650s AD, a new figure stepped onto the precarious throne, a man whose name was Sigeberht, later canonized by history, perhaps with a touch of tragic irony, as Sigeberht the Good. Unlike his fiercely independent predecessors, Sigeberht understood that isolation was a death sentence for a kingdom wedged between giants. He sought a lifeline, a powerful friend to shield Essex from the ravenous Mercian war machine. That lifeline was found far to the north, in the court of Oswiu, the powerful Christian king of Northumbria. Sigeberht journeyed north, not just seeking spiritual guidance, but performing a desperate, pragmatic act of political submission. He knelt before Oswiu, accepted baptism, and returned to Essex armed not with swords, but with the promise of divine protection, and, crucially,
a highly trained spiritual army.
Oswiu provided the catalyst for the second, and arguably most important Christian mission to the East Saxons. This time, the envoys were not the Romanized, relatively soft clerics of Canterbury, but the severe, iron-willed monks of the Celtic tradition, specifically those trained in the harsh, disciplined environment of Lindisfarne.
The leader of this relentless evangelical force was a man named Cedd. Cedd was pure willpower manifested, a fiery preacher steeped in the asceticism and uncompromising zeal of the Northern Church. He arrived with his brother, Chada, determined not merely to convert the king, but to anchor the faith permanently into the unstable soil of Essex.
Cedd's strategy was immediate and profound. Establish fortresses of faith that could withstand the inevitable political storms. He understood that relying solely on the fickle heart of a single king was doomed to repeat the failures of the past. He needed tangible, lasting structures and powerful, visible centers of learning. His first and most haunting creation was at Ethankestir, a desolate spit of land now known as Bradwell-on-Sea. Cedd deliberately chose a location steeped in the ancient power of permanence. The massive, crumbling ruins of the Roman coastal fort, Othona. He didn't build a new church, he consecrated the old stones. He transformed the abandoned headquarters of the Roman garrison into a sanctuary, the chapel of St. Peter on the Wall. This was a powerful statement, using the ruins of the dead empire to build the foundation of the Christian future, a desperate plea for stability in a land that knew only chaos. Imagine the scene. Cedd, his voice raw from preaching, addressing his new, bewildered congregation within walls built to repel Saxon pirates centuries before, the cold North Sea wind whipping across the salt marshes, replacing the shouts of centurions with the solemn chants of the liturgy. This simple, enduring structure remains a spectral witness to the fragility of Essex history.
Cedd also established a key center further south at Tilbury, guaranteeing that the mission was spread across the breadth of the kingdom, slowly attempting to root the faith among the local chieftains and common folk. King Sigeberht, inspired and perhaps overly zealous, threw his full support behind the effort, ordering the destruction of ancient pagan shrines.
But the conversion of the king did not mean the conversion of the kingdom. The powerful ealdormen, the local lords whose authority derived from the old ways, and the localized pagan cults, watched Cedd's success with cold, building fury. They saw the Christian mission not as salvation, but as an invasive force, destroying the sources of their ancient power and submitting the East Saxons to foreign, Northumbrian influence. The tension became palpable, a slow venom poisoning Sigeberht's court. The chroniclers record a specific, chilling confrontation that sealed the fate of the reforming king. Sigeberht, in a moment of political necessity or misplaced diplomacy, visited the house of an alderman who was fiercely, openly pagan and defiantly refusing Cedd's authority. Cedd, hearing of this betrayal of principle, erupted in terrifying prophetic rage. He confronted Sigeberht not with gentle rebuke, but with a terrible public curse. He declared that because the king had entered the house of God's enemy, he himself would die in that very house. A curse that hung heavy over the unstable kingdom, predicting the violence that was always just beneath the surface of East Saxon political life. And the curse was dreadfully fulfilled. Sigeberht the Good did not die in old age or on the battlefield against a foreign foe. He was assassinated by his own kinsmen. Two brothers, Swithfrith and Swifhelm, fueled by pagan zeal and political resentment over Sigeberht's submission to Northumbrian and Christian authority, ambushed him, cutting short his reign of precarious peace. They murdered their king, proving once again that the most fatal flaw of Essex was not its geographical vulnerability, but the bloody internecine chaos that boiled relentlessly within the ruling class. The beacon of hope was extinguished. The kingdom was plunged immediately back into terrifying uncertainty, leaderless and unstable around 660 AD. The cycle had turned again. The cost of maintaining stability or importing faith in Essex was always paid in royal blood. And the stage was now set for the next agonizing episode of submission, this time under the direct, crushing shadow of a terrifying new power, the ultimate definition of Anglo-Saxon brutality, who would redefine the meaning of foreign dominance. We left the East Saxons shivering under the colossal shadow of a conqueror whose name was whispered in fear across the entire island: Mercia. This wasn't just a powerful neighbor. This was an apex predator, a geopolitical black hole centered in the Midlands, systematically devouring every scrap of independence around it. Essex, already small and historically irrelevant to the grand chronicles, now became a mere economic footnote, a tributary state whose destiny was no longer its own, but dictated by the will of the terrifying kings from the west. Imagine the suffocating pressure. The moment a Mercian alderman rode into London or Colchester, the local Essex reeve knew his authority evaporated entirely. Taxes weren't negotiated, they were extracted, often in harsh levies of silver, goods, or, perhaps worst of all, military service forced upon the sons of Essex to fight Mercia's wars against Northumbria or Wessex. This isn't collaboration. This is systemic strangulation, where the very identity of the East Saxon ruling class began to erode, slowly replaced by Mercian puppets or loyalists seeking to survive the endless storm. And the religion? Oh, the constant traumatic flip-flop that defined the soul of this doomed kingdom. Remember Cedd, the holy man who brought the light of the Roman faith, establishing the great monastery at Bradwell-on-Sea. That precarious Christian foothold was instantly threatened by the deep-rooted, terrifying paganism emanating from the Mercian court, especially during the reign of figures like the formidable, ruthless Penda.
Penda, the last great pagan king, saw Christianity not as salvation, but as a political weapon wielded by his northern enemies, Northumbria. So while the Essex kings, desperate to maintain some connection to the wider Christian world, and perhaps Wessex, tried to cling to their new faith, the overlords demanded deference to the old ways, to the gods of the earth and the sword. This created a schism that ripped through the very fabric of East Saxon society, setting brother against brother, priest against noble, all because the geography placed them exactly where two seismic cultural plates collided.
It was during this age of crushing servitude, around the year 664, that a horror far worse than any army swept across the land, the infamous, terrifying Great Plague. This wasn't just sickness. This was perceived as divine judgment, the ultimate proof that the new foreign god had abandoned them. Panic took hold like wildfire, and the people, seeking immediate, visceral comfort, fled back to the ancient gods of their ancestors, the gods they believed held the power to stop the dying. This desperate reversion to paganism was led by none other than Sigeberht, one of the co-rulers of Essex at the time, whose faith was clearly made of glass. The churches emptied, the sacred stones were overturned, and the old sacrificial altars, stained with forgotten blood, were quickly put back into use, a horrifying step backward in the eyes of the few remaining Christian loyalists. Imagine the scene: frantic, terrified families sacrificing animals, chanting to ancient spirits, while the bodies piled up in the streets, a kingdom tearing itself apart spiritually under the strain of pestilence and foreign fear. This chaos, this sudden, violent relapse, could not stand in the greater Anglo-Saxon political chess game. Even Wulfhere, the new, powerful king of Mercia, who himself was a Christian, a powerful shift from Pendestime, could not tolerate the instability. Wulfhere didn't care about their souls. He cared about control. A pagan revolt was an unpredictable liability right next to his vital trade routes along the Thames. So, Wulfhere acted, not as a missionary, but as a punishing overlord. He dispatched Bishop Jereman, a man of immense political weight, into Essex. Jereman's mission was simple: purge the pagan residue, remind the kings who truly held the leash, and restore order under a Mercian-approved version of Christianity. The East Saxons were forced back into the fold, not by spiritual conviction alone, but by the overwhelming, unmistakable threat of Mercian legions waiting just beyond the Thames. The message was brutal and crystal clear. You may choose your god, but only if your overlord approves of the choice. This relentless external control meant the kings of Essex became little more than high-status regional governors, puppets dancing on Mercian strings. The true power of the East Saxons to make independent decisions, to forge alliances, or even to raise an army of their own, was utterly destroyed. They were officially reduced to a permanent client state. For the next century, the history of Essex essentially vanishes into the shadows, a ghost kingdom existing only as a revenue stream for the sprawling Mercian Empire. Their kings become barely traceable footnotes, their autonomy reduced to administering local grievances, while the true power flowed entirely from Tamworth.
This silence in the records is the loudest warning sign of all. Essex was no longer a player. It was a property.
This slow suffocation reached its absolute, horrifying peak with the arrival of the most legendary, most feared, and most administratively brilliant tyrant the Anglo-Saxon world had ever known, King Offa of Mercia. Offa didn't just demand submission, he demanded erasure. He was the architect of an empire so vast, so organized, that he truly believed he was the rightful successor to the Roman emperors themselves. Under Offa's iron fist, the East Saxon kings, men like Sigeberht, were forced into an impossible choice: total subservience or immediate, violent extinction. Offa viewed London, the jewel on the Thames, as rightfully Mercian territory, and the tiny, weak kingdom of Essex was merely an inconvenient border smudge he intended to wipe clean. The economic policies were devastating. Offa was known for his massive building projects, his impressive minting of coinage, and his international diplomacy, all funded by the relentless, grinding extraction of wealth from his tributary states. Essex was bled dry, its resources diverted west, its local power structures systematically dismantled until there was nothing left but the bare administrative shell. This was the final, agonizing chapter of submission, before the inevitable fate of assimilation, a fate worse than mere conquest, the absolute, terrified silence of historical insignificance. We are now entering the final death throes of the East Saxon dream, a moment where the very borders of the kingdom ceased to be relevant, where the Mercian machine tightened its grip for the last time, preparing to devour the entire kingdom whole. But even the mighty grip of Mercia could not last forever, and the vacuum left by Mercia's eventual decline would bring an even darker terror to the shores of the East Saxons, a terror arriving on longships, smelling of salt and blood, ready to end the Anglo-Saxon dream entirely. For generations, Essex had looked inland, dreading the hoofbeats of the Mercian cavalry, bracing for the weight of Offa's shadow. They had prayed for relief, for a break in the pressure, for the mighty inland giant to finally fall to internal rot. But when that moment came, when the central pillar of the Midlands finally began to crack and crumble, the relief lasted only a heartbeat. Because the true terror did not ride a horse or marched in a disciplined line, it sliced through the waves, a silent, terrible storm descending upon the vulnerable coastland of the East Saxons. The ships that arrived were not the friendly merchant vessels that traded in their estuaries, nor the fishing boats of their kinsmen. These were instruments of chaos, sleek, shallow-drafted killing machines, carrying warriors who seemed to feel no pain, warriors who laughed at the thought of Christian heaven, men whose very names became a curse whispered in the dark corners of timber halls. The Vikings. The sea did not offer salvation. It offered annihilation. The geographical destiny of Essex, which had already doomed it to be Mercia's pawn, now condemned it to be the first casualty of the most seismic shift in Anglo-Saxon history. The year is now moving into the terrifying second half of the 9th century, and the world is being fundamentally reshaped by blood and iron. For Essex, geographically doomed to be a frontline target due to its extensive, undefended shoreline, the raids were merciless, brutal, and utterly unpredictable. They struck Burnham, they hit Malden, they sailed right up the rivers, and they exploited every shallow inlet and tidal creek that had once made the kingdom rich through trade. The wealth built up over a century, the silver, the relics, the agricultural surplus, was instantly marked for destruction or extraction by these relentless maritime predators. The kings of Essex, whose names are now fading shadows in the few fragmented charters that survive, found themselves utterly powerless. They had spent decades maneuvering against Mercian weight, only to discover they had zero defense capability against this new, fluid threat that vanished back to the unforgiving sea as quickly as it appeared. But the hit-and-run raids were just the practice round, the cruel appetizer before the main feast of terror arrived in 865 AD. This was not a band of opportunistic marauders. This was the Mikil-Hedr, the great heathen army, a coalition of Scandinavian warbands so vast it swallowed entire established kingdoms whole, changing the nature of warfare forever. They descended upon the neighboring kingdom of East Anglia first, executing their king, Edmund. A sacrifice so horrifying it sent a shock-wave of dread across every remaining Saxon realm. And suddenly, Essex realized that its historical insignificance, its lack of documentation, offered no protection whatsoever from this existential threat. They were directly in the path of the storm, trapped between the colossal invading force sweeping south and the last bastion of true resistance, the rapidly consolidating kingdom of Wessex under the rising star of Alfred. Essex was not conquered in a single glorious battle. It was simply absorbed, like water soaking into dry earth, its identity dissolving into the wider conflict. The Danes didn't need to destroy the East Saxon structure. They merely needed to occupy the key economic and military points, particularly the gateway city to the south, London. When the Danes took Lundenwic, the ancient heart of the region, the very place where the East Saxons drew their trade and wealth, it was an effective death blow to the independent identity of the kingdom. The land east of the River Lee, the traditional core of Essex proper, became Danish-occupied territory, a forward base of operations used to pressure the Wessex defenses further south and west. The story of Essex now stopped being the story of its own kings and became a bloody footnote in the legend of one man, Alfred of Wessex, the king who refused to break. After years of brutal fighting, the moment of truth arrived at Edington in 878, where Alfred delivered a crippling, yet not fatal, blow to the main Danish forces. The resulting peace treaty, the famous Treaty of Wedmore, drew a line of geopolitical devastation across England, creating the Danelaw. And where did this devastating arbitrary scar run? Right through the historic heartland of the East Saxons. The treaty acknowledged the Danish right to settle and rule north and east of a line drawn up the Thames, then up the River Lee, and finally cutting across to Bedford. This meant that the northern and central parts of the historic Essex territory, areas like Hertford and Middlesex, were now legally under Danish control, ruled by the fearsome warlord Guthrum. The rest of the region, the sliver clinging desperately to the south and west near the Thames, was technically considered Alfred's sphere of influence, yet it was a land racked by constant, violent border skirmishes. The conversion of Guthrum to Christianity, with Alfred acting as his godfather, was a strategic masterpiece designed to stabilize the region. But do not mistake this moment for peace. This was merely a pause, a heavily armed truce that left the people of Essex utterly fractured, living in a terrifying political and cultural no-man's land. Imagine the crushing loss of identity. Their land was partitioned, their ancient religious centers were looted, and now they were subject to the whims of Danish jarls who demanded tribute, known chillingly as Danegeld, just to spare their crops and homes. The once proud, if troubled, independence of the East Saxons had been utterly dissolved. They had become a crucial, bloody chess piece in the grand strategy of Alfred, utilized as a shield against the endless appetite of the Vikings in the Danelaw. Their primary function was no longer self-governance or expansion. Their fate was to stand as the ultimate sacrifice, the perpetual buffer state, designed to absorb the first shockwaves so that Wessex itself might survive and consolidate into a future England. Alfred, however, understood that this purely defensive position could only last so long. To truly secure the future of the Anglo-Saxons, he had to go on the offensive, and that offensive started with the retaking of the great prize, London. In 886 A.D., Alfred famously marched on the ancient city, driving out the occupying Danish forces and setting about the monumental task of fortifying it. This was a masterstroke of political theater and military engineering, transforming the dilapidated Roman ruins into a formidable burg of London. And here is the crucial link to Essex. Once Alfred held London, he could no longer ignore the immediate threat across the river. The territory of Essex suddenly became a viable target for reclamation, a vital stepping stone to push the Danish line back toward the north and east. It was the very beginning of the glorious, terrifying phase known as the Reconquest, a decades-long struggle led by Alfred's successors, the next generation of West Saxon lions who sought to finally reunify the fractured island under a single banner. Edward the Elder, Alfred's powerful son, inherited this relentless mission. His focus was clear: secure London completely, and then systematically dismantle the Danish hold on the adjacent lands, starting with the fragmented, wounded territory of Essex. But this was no easy task. The Danes were deeply entrenched, their settlements established, their power centered around places like Colchester,
which was now a formidable Danish stronghold. The final phase of assimilation would not be subtle. It would be a long, grinding war of attrition, one bloody skirmish after another, fought on the very soil of the East Saxons.
The question remained, could the East Saxons survive this final traumatic process of ununification, or would their identity be utterly sacrificed on the altar of a greater West Saxon England? The long-predicted erasure was closer than ever, masked only by the promise of salvation from the south, a salvation that demanded their absolute loyalty and subjugation. The promised salvation from the south, the protective shield of Wessex, was revealed for what it truly was, a golden shackle. Essex had traded the chaos of absolute independence for the quiet humiliation of vassalage, becoming a junior satellite, its kings often compelled to pledge fealty and offer tribute to the powerful lords of the West Saxons just to maintain the semblance of their crown. They were a buffer state, an inconvenient necessity for their larger neighbors, but this fragile, costly peace was merely the eye of a storm, a brief, deceptive calm before the true apocalyptic menace arrived from the deep, forgotten heart of the island. This was the era when the sleeping giant of Mercia finally roused itself, shaking the foundations of the entire Heptarchy. While the chroniclers obsessively documented the wars between Northumbria and Wessex, it was Mercia, under the terrifying pagan king Penda, that was quietly forging an unstoppable military machine, driven by a brutal, uncompromising devotion to the ancient gods. Penda did not see Essex as a potential ally or even a rival. He saw it as a soft, ripe target, a strategically perfect eastern buffer zone that could easily be brought to heel. His shadow was long and suffocating, stretching across every baptized stone and every consecrated field in Britain. And under this relentless pressure, we find the tragically pivotal reign of Sigeberht the Good, a king caught in an impossible, fatal vice. Sigeberht had attempted to embrace stability, accepting the Christian faith, perhaps out of genuine conviction, but certainly out of political necessity, seeking the spiritual and diplomatic alignment that the powerful Christian kingdoms offered. He sought to anchor his unstable, vulnerable kingdom to the rock of Rome. But the pagan roots of his people were not merely deep. They were bedrock, nourished by centuries of custom, deeply cynical political memory, and a fresh wave of fear. The moment Penda's legions began to flex their pagan muscles, the Christian veneer Sigeberht had painstakingly applied cracked instantly, revealing the dark, ancient gods beneath. Gods who, the people whispered, seemed far stronger and more capable of protection than the distant, meek, white Christ. This is the period that demanded the return of a true missionary warrior, and that warrior was Cedd, a Northumbrian monk of immense zeal and iron will, dispatched south to try and mend the shattered spiritual infrastructure that had been abandoned years earlier by the flight of Miletus. Cedd was tasked by Sigeberht to rebuild the faith not just in hearts, but in stone, establishing crucial monastic centers that were spiritual fortresses against the encroaching darkness. He founded the great abbey at Bradwell-on-Sea, known then as Othona, an isolated, defiant beacon built within the ruins of a massive Roman fort, utilizing those ancient walls as a potent symbol of enduring civilization and order. He also established a significant mission center at Tilbury, attempting to seed the faith among the common people along the Thames estuary, the lifeblood of the East Saxon territory. But the task was immense, and the resistance was chillingly organized. The powerful pagan nobility, witnessing Penda's staggering success, viewed Cedd not as a shepherd, but as an agent of foreign, weakening powers. They feared that the Christian insistence on peace and singular loyalty would doom their warrior culture and invite Mercian destruction, convinced that the abandonment of Woden and Thunor was the true cause of their political misery. The tension in the royal court became a suffocating air of quiet violence. Sigeberht was forced to weigh the absolute risk of remaining Christian, thereby inviting Penda's wrath and an internal revolt, against the shame and spiritual collapse of plunging his kingdom entirely back into the darkness. He tried to navigate this impossible path, balancing piety with the political reality of Mercia's immediate proximity. But the external pressure was too great, and the internal resentment was too bitter. The ultimate tipping point arrived not from an external Mercian invasion, but from a deep, bloody betrayal in the very halls of power. Two East Saxon noblemen, often identified as brothers, perhaps Swithelm and Switfrith, became convinced that Sigeberht's piety was the primary danger to the kingdom's survival and their own prestige. They saw his alignment with the soft Christian South as an act of treason against the necessary ruthlessness required for survival in the Anglo-Saxon world. In a catastrophic act of political and religious assassination, they murdered King Sigeberht the Good, proving in the most brutal fashion possible that the entire Christian mission in Essex was frighteningly dependent on the lifeblood and political will of a single, fragile king. The murder sent shock waves, and the fragile Christian infrastructure Cedd had labored to build collapsed almost instantly. The pagan brothers seized control, and the kingdom, desperate and utterly terrified of the colossal, merciless Mercian machine looming to the west, officially and violently reverted to the old ways. This was not a slow spiritual decay. It was an instantaneous, brutal snapback, erasing years of agonizing missionary work in a matter of days. Essex was once again, officially, a land of ancient, terrifying gods, a dark, isolated island surrounded by the rising tide of Christian England, its political autonomy utterly shattered. The chroniclers had barely begun to record its demise, and the stage was now set for the final desperate struggle for independence, a struggle fought under the absolute, suffocating shadow of Mercia, the true power broker of the 7th century. The year is 664 A.D. The Synod of Whitby has just concluded, reshaping the religious map of Britain. But for the beleaguered kings of Essex, the theological arguments were a distant, almost luxurious concern. Their true and immediate problem was far more terrestrial, far heavier, and it wore the crown of Mercia. This colossal land beast, growing in size and ferocity year after agonizing year, was not just a neighboring kingdom, it was the gravitational pull that was slowly, inevitably, tearing Essex apart, molecule by molecule. It was an age where sovereignty was measured not in bloodlines, but in brute military potential, and Mercia's potential was terrifyingly limitless. The Mercian king Wulfhere, a figure whose ambition burned hotter than any forge in the Midlands, saw the East Saxons not as peers or even allies, but as a strategically vital buffer zone, a convenient launchpad for raids into Kent or across the Thames. For Sigeberht, the king of Essex, looking north meant seeing a master holding the leash, a chain pulled tighter with every passing season, threatening to choke off the last vestiges of his royal authority. Sigeberht, perhaps driven mad by the psychological pressure and the devastation of a recent plague that swept through the land, had made a desperate, almost suicidal political gamble. He attempted to revert to paganism. This shocking, cataclysmic regression showed the true fragility of the early Christian structure in Essex, which had barely survived its first attempt at conversion. But Wulfhere, ever the pragmatic overlord, saw instability only as opportunity, a chance to solidify his spiritual and political annexation of the eastern territories. He quickly dispatched Jaruman, the bishop of Mercia, not merely to convert Sigeherd's soul and restore the Christian faith, but to reinforce Mercia's absolute political grip under the guise of saving it. Conversion under these terms was not salvation. It was annexation by doctrine, a military religious operation designed to cement vassalage forever. The East Saxons were forced into a suffocating arrangement. They maintained the illusion of a crown and the empty title of Rex, but the reality was absolute servitude. They paid tribute in silver, in cattle, and most crucially, they paid in blood. Whenever Wulfhere marched his massive armies to confront Northumbria or challenge Wessex, the East Saxon Fyrd was expected to march alongside him, their bodies acting as the expendable first shield against Mercian enemies. This enforced military service was a cruel historical irony. They were sacrificing their own sons and brothers to maintain the overwhelming power of the very kingdom that was actively and systematically erasing their history. This was no longer merely high-stakes diplomacy. It was a slow-motion political strangulation, meticulously executed by the most powerful state. Every battle fought for Mercia, every life lost in a foreign campaign, was a nail driven into the coffin of independent Essex sovereignty. Yet, the alternative, open armed rebellion against the Mercian war machine, was unthinkable. Wulfhere's legions were, quite literally, legion, and the East Saxon army was too depleted, too demoralized, and too divided to offer any meaningful resistance. They were trapped in a cycle of obedience and decline. When Wulfhere finally passed from the stage of history in 675 AD, a pathetic, almost momentary flicker of hope might have briefly ignited in the halls of the Essex kings. But the suffocating darkness returned swiftly with the ascent of Ethelred, Wulfhere's brother, a king perhaps less outwardly flamboyant, but equally cold and determined to maintain the Mercian hegemony.
The Essex crown continued its frantic spin on a pinhead. The kings, now constantly squabbling and ruling jointly, Sabby and Sigeberht sharing power, a recipe for guaranteed chaos, could not even agree on their own internal policies, let alone formulate a unified defense strategy against their external masters.
This internal fracture was the absolute perfect environment for Mercian control. Ethelred didn't need to commit to a costly, large-scale invasion. He merely needed to stand back and watch the internal wounds fester, occasionally applying calculated pressure to ensure the complete obedience of his vassal states. The greatest, most agonizing symbol of Essex's diminished status and humiliation was the city of London itself. Lundenwic, once the bustling, vital center of East Saxon trade and potential power, had slipped almost entirely out of their effective control. By this time, it was firmly recognized as a Mercian tributary, or, at the absolute best, a shared dependency, where Mercian influence was always and irreversibly paramount, overshadowing every East Saxon decision. Losing London was a geopolitical catastrophe, akin to losing the heart and lungs of the kingdom simultaneously. It stripped the East Saxons of their primary economic engine, their main source of tax revenue, and their strategic foothold on the essential River Thames. They were landlocked politically, pushed back into the less fertile, vulnerable north of their domain.
Northumbria, unified for less than 2 decades under Edwin's strong, benevolent hand, immediately fractured, tearing itself apart under the stress of the disaster. The fragile political bond between Bernicia and Deira snapped, proving once again that the foundational instability of the kingdom was its greatest, most fatal weakness.
The ancient, festering rivalry immediately resurfaced, poisoning the atmosphere as the defeated remnants of Edwin's court desperately scattered. The vacuum left by the fallen Bretwalda was terrifyingly large, and into that vacuum stepped the merciless boot of Cadwallon. What followed was the most dreadful year in Northumbrian memory, a period often simply referred to as the Year of the Sword, or Cadwallon's Reign of Terror. The Briton king, having achieved his goal of vengeance, showed no mercy, systematically ravaging the Northumbrian lands, hunting down the surviving royal lineage, and crushing any semblance of resistance. He did not seek to rule the Saxons. He sought to eradicate them, to cleanse the land of their presence, turning the fields of Bernicia and Deira into open slaughterhouses. The Christian clergy, who had flourished under Edwin, were especially targeted, facing martyrdom and destruction as the pagan forces celebrated their victory. The kingdom was plunged into a state of absolute anarchy, a complete regression from the sophisticated rule Edwin had established. The very idea of a unified Northumbria vanished overnight, replaced by 2 desperate, fragmented principalities scrambling for survival under the shadow of the Terror King. In Deira, Edwin's cousin, Osric, managed to seize the throne, while in Bernicia the rule fell to Eanfrith, Ethelfrith's son, who had returned from exile upon Edwin's defeat. But their reigns were pathetic, defined only by fear and apostasy. To appease the furious pagan British power structure, both kings instantly renounced the Christian faith that Edwin had championed, attempting to buy their survival by reverting to the old, familiar gods of their ancestors. This desperate maneuver was the ultimate sign of Northumbria's instantaneous spiritual and political collapse, a complete rejection of Edwin's legacy, simply to stay alive. Yet appeasement failed. Within 12 short months, both Osric and Eanfrith were brutally assassinated by Cadwallon, proving that the taste of power was sweeter to the Briton than any short-lived truce. Cadwallon's rampage had successfully reduced the proudest kingdom in Anglo-Saxon England to a broken, headless corpse, awaiting the final, fatal blow. The stage was now perfectly set for the true hero of this chronicle to emerge, the man who had witnessed the terror firsthand, and now carried the weight of his entire defeated nation upon his shoulders. This was Oswald, Eanfrith's brother, another son of the terrifying Ethelfrith, a man forged in the unforgiving fire of exile and defeat. He was the last true hope against the relentless tide of destruction, the final chance for Northumbria to pull itself back from the abyss of annihilation and re-establish the supremacy that its geography demanded. But to do so, he would have to face the unimaginable terror of Cadwallon's legions, a task that seemed utterly impossible given the recent devastating failures of his predecessors. The fate of Northumbria, Christianity in the north, and potentially the entire future of English identity now rested on the shoulders of this one desperate prince who had nowhere left to run and nothing left to lose. The resurrection was about to begin, but the cost would be astronomical. The moment Edwin rode back into the heart of Deira, the air crackled, not with celebration, but with a palpable sense of dread. The long, terrifying shadow of Aethelfrith the Destroyer had finally been lifted, only to be replaced by the blinding, vengeful glare of his ancient rival, Prince Edwin. Backed by the immense military might of King Raedwald of East Anglia, the man who had sheltered him for years, Edwin didn't just claim the throne, he seized it with the cold, precise fury of a man who had waited decades for this very moment. He immediately set about dismantling every last vestige of the Bernician supremacy, shifting the center of gravity back to his ancient patrimony in Deira, anchoring his new regime in the burgeoning city of York. The immediate purge was swift and absolute, but once the blood was cleaned from the streets, Edwin revealed a side of kingship Northumbria had never witnessed: order. This was no mere warrior king. This was an architect of empire. The chroniclers would later speak of the Pax Edwini, a peace so profound, so absolute, that a woman could walk from coast to coast with a babe in her arms and never fear attack. And the king himself ordered brass drinking cups placed near public fountains for the common traveler, a sign of wealth and stability unimaginable just a generation prior. Edwin pushed the boundaries of Northumbrian influence further than even the feared Ethelfrith dared. He conquered the strategic Isle of Man, the naval gateway to Ireland, and then pushed deep into the ancient lands of the Britons, dominating the great western city of Elmet, crushing its ruler Ceredic, and effectively eliminating the largest independent British enclave left in the region. His sheer military and diplomatic weight grew so immense that even the distant kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex, the rising behemoths of the south, paid trembling homage to him, recognizing him as their overlord. Edwin truly became the Bretwalda, the unchallenged high king of all the southern Anglo-Saxons, sitting on a throne that seemed destined to endure for centuries, securing the future of the English identity he carried.
But the very foundation of this unprecedented power was about to be challenged, not by swords and shields, but by an entirely new force that swept in from the south, the arrival of the Roman faith, carried on the back of political marriage and desperate diplomacy. The storytellers speak of a solemn day when a small, dark-robed man named Paulinus arrived in Edwin's court, sent by the powerful Kentish king Ethelbert and his Christian wife, Queen Ethelberg, who was now bound to Edwin in marriage. Paulinus was not just a priest, he was a silent, persistent psychological weapon, a constant reminder of the wider, older world of Rome and its terrifying, centralized power. He didn't preach fire and brimstone immediately. He offered cosmic certainty and the promise of eternal empire, a spiritual stability that contrasted sharply with the chaotic cycle of regicide and vengeance that defined Northumbrian history. For years, Edwin wavered, caught in a terrifying spiritual limbo between the ancient, blood-soaked majesty of Woden, the god of fury and victory, and the sophisticated, world-spanning promise of the Christian God, whose followers seemed to control the most powerful empires on earth. The tension in the great hall of Edwin was suffocating, a psychological war fought entirely within the royal court. Every earl and every warrior watched their king wrestle with a decision that would redefine their very existence, a decision that carried the very real risk of divine retribution from the ancient, savage gods of the northern forests and icy seas. The moment of truth arrived in a great council meeting, an event mythologized for 1,000 years by the chroniclers, where Edwin, in a voice heavy with fate, called upon his wisest counselors to speak openly about the merits of this new creed. First spoke the chief priest, Coifi, the man whose entire life had been dedicated to serving the pagan gods of the north, the very embodiment of the old religious order. Coifi, shockingly, admitted that the old gods were powerless and had granted him no special favor, despite his lifelong devotion to them and his constant sacrifices. He pointed out the utter futility of their ancient rituals and the spiritual void they left behind. He used the most famous metaphor in all Anglo-Saxon history to explain the sudden hope the new religion offered. None of us knows for certain what comes before this life or what comes after it. This life of man is like the flight of a sparrow through a warm, lit hall, he declared, his voice ringing with desperate clarity.
The bird flies quickly in one door and out the other, fleeing the dark storm outside,
and we see it for a moment, enjoying the light and warmth, but know nothing of where it came from or where it is going. If this new doctrine can tell us something more certain, something of the soul's journey, then let us embrace it.
The dramatic climax was instantaneous and utterly irreversible. Kofi himself, the high priest of Woden, demanded a horse and armor, forbidden garb for a pagan priest, and rode out at once to the great temple of the old gods at Goodmanham. He carried an axe forged for war, and he personally desecrated the altar, smashing the carved idols of the sky and the earth with his own hands, proving to his stunned countrymen that the gods of their ancestors were truly impotent.
This act was a seismic shift, the spiritual equivalent of 1,000 lightning strikes against the Northumbrian soul. Edwin converted immediately, receiving baptism on Easter Day in 627 A.D., in a small, hastily constructed wooden church in York, a spot where the magnificent York Minster would one day stand. The golden age of Deira, now officially Christian, had begun, bound not by blood and vengeance, but by the power of the Roman cross and the sophisticated ideology it brought. But in the shadows, far to the west, and deep in the impenetrable forests of the Midlands, two forces were watching Edwin's glittering success with burning hatred that transcended political calculation. The great King Penda of Mercia, a pagan warlord of unmatched brutality, saw Edwin's conversion as weakness and his expansion as a direct mortal insult to the old ways.
Even more dangerous was the exiled and enraged British king Cadwallon of Gwynedd, who hated the English invaders with a raw, ancient passion that transcended political rivalry, remembering the brutality Edwin had inflicted upon his people. Cadwallon had been brutally driven out by Edwin, and now he was plotting a furious, bloody return, aligning himself with the greatest pagan threat the island had ever known.
Edwin, secure in his new-found glory and the dazzling peace he had forged, felt utterly untouchable after 17 glorious years of expansion. The very idea of the unified kingdom of Northumbria, of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes becoming one conquering Christian force, was Edwin's greatest achievement. But his very success had drawn the attention of the wolves who would devour him whole. The stage was set for an apocalypse. The newly Christian, universally powerful Northumbrian state, the shining jewel of Britain, was about to collide head-on with the unstoppable, savage, pagan rage of Penda and the cold, relentless vengeance of Cadwallon. The gilded peace was a lie, and the cost of Edwin's immense ambition was finally coming due. The ultimate betrayal and the return to blood-soaked chaos was just over the horizon. The gilded peace was not merely a lie, it was a deadly trap, and Edwin, the self-proclaimed Emperor of Britain, walked straight into the jaws of the most terrifying alliance the island had ever conceived. Penda, the ferocious pagan king of Mercia, whose very name would soon be synonymous with relentless warfare, had joined hands with Cadwallon, the vengeful Welsh king of Gwynedd, whose hatred for Northumbria transcended all logic, faith, or political maneuvering. This was not a war for territory. This was a war for annihilation, and Edwin, softened by years of undisputed supremacy, was entirely unprepared for the sheer, focused brutality aimed directly at his heart.
The date was 633 AD, and the fields surrounding Hatfield Chase were about to become the graveyard of an empire. Edwin had reigned with such prestige that he believed his position was unassailable, perhaps truly convinced that the new Christian God he served would shield him from the ancient, blood-soaked fury of the world he had brutally conquered. But at Hatfield Chase, divine intervention was nowhere to be found. Only the cold, hard steel wielded by two kings whose motive was pure, unadulterated destruction.
The clash was less a battle and more an immediate, horrifying rout. Edwin's forces, perhaps too complacent, perhaps betrayed by the speed and intensity of the combined Mercian and Welsh assault, were utterly overwhelmed, driven back into the swampy lands where the slaughter was absolute. This was the moment the mighty Northumbrian dominion, built so precariously upon the brutal foundations laid by Adelfrith, finally shattered under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the external hammer blow of two implacable foes. The great King Edwin, the man who had brought the cross to the north and commanded the allegiance of nearly every ruler south of the Forth, fell that day, dying the inglorious death of a common soldier, hacked down in the chaos. His son and heir, Osfrith, perished attempting to shield his father, and the entire edifice of Northumbrian power instantly evaporated into the freezing air. The moment Edwin's massive empire collapsed, the suppressed rivalries between Bernicia and Deira burst forth in a spasm of renewed, self-destructive violence. The kingdom immediately fractured back into its two original, bitterly opposed halves, fulfilling the curse that had haunted the region since the days of Ida the Flame-Bearer. Deira, desperate to maintain the supremacy of Edwin's lineage, immediately crowned Osric, a close cousin of the fallen king. Simultaneously, Bernicia seized the opportunity to throw off the Dairin yoke, calling back Eanfrith, one of Aethelfrith the Destroyer's surviving sons, who had languished for 17 years in cold exile among the Picts and Scots. What followed was known forever in the grim history books as the Annus Horribilis, the terrible year. Northumbria had ceased to be a kingdom and had become a scorched, desolate killing ground, subjected to the unchecked, terrifying wrath of Cadwallon. The Welsh king was not satisfied with victory. He demanded total vengeance against the hated Anglo-Saxons, sweeping through the region like a force of nature, slaughtering indiscriminately, heedless of their frantic, desperate attempts to re-establish order. Osric of Deira, foolish enough to try and trap the relentless Welshman within the fortifications of a besieged city, was cut down and killed instantly by Cadwallon, his brief reign lasting mere months. Eanfrith of Bernicia, equally desperate and perhaps lacking the killer instinct of his father Aethelfrith, attempted to sue for peace, approaching Cadwallon with a small retinue, offering tribute and supplication. It was the ultimate, fatal miscalculation. Cadwallon, the butcher of the north, had absolutely no intention of negotiating. He saw Eanfrith's overtures as a sign of weakness, and promptly had the returning son of Athelfrith assassinated, completing the double regicide with contemptuous ease. Within the span of 12 horrific months, the greatest power in Britain had been utterly decimated, witnessing the violent deaths of 3 kings, proving that the internal malignancy of the kingdom was far more fatal than any external enemy. The entire Ethelfrithing dynasty, which had fought so long and so hard against the Dairen threat, had now been nearly exterminated, not by their rivals, but by a foreign Welsh sword. The irony was a cruel twist of fate, cementing the belief among the few surviving clergy that the kingdom was fundamentally cursed, a place where ambition was always answered by immediate, brutal retribution. Churches burned, monasteries were sacked, and the land was left desolate, a horrifying monument to the cost of Edwin's ambition and Penda's rise. But even in the blackest night, a tiny, improbable candle of hope remained, flickering in the far northern reaches of exile. Watching the complete and utter collapse of his homeland from the distant, cold monastery of Iona, another of Aethelfrith's sons was finally ready to return. This was Oswald, who, unlike his ill-fated brother Eanfrith, had spent his 17 years in exile, not dreaming of the past, but forging a new future. Oswald had embraced the rugged, ascetic Christianity of the Irish monks, transforming his internal exile into a spiritual and martial apprenticeship. He understood that brute force alone, the method that had failed every king before him, could not defeat the combined terror of Cadwallon and the rising pagan tide of Mercia. He needed more than an army. He needed a divine, unwavering mandate. Returning with only a tiny, faithful band of followers, Oswald was the unlikely, final hope for a kingdom utterly drowning in blood and despair. His mission was terrifyingly simple: to challenge the merciless Cadwallon and fight a battle against odds so impossible that they required not tactical genius, but absolute, fanatical faith. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, where a cross would be raised against the might of the terrifying Welsh Avenger in a desolate, forgotten corner of the broken kingdom. The year is no longer simply about holding the line. It's about surviving the seismic replacement of empires. Armenia had learned how to dance with the relaxed, decentralized Parthian Arsacids, often sharing a family tree and mutual enemies. But the ancient world was about to be reshaped by a terror far more focused, far more zealous, and absolutely intolerant of anything that wasn't Persian blood and Persian fire worship. This was not the amiable, Hellenized Parthia. This was the rise of the Sasanian Empire, a dynasty forged in the searing heat of ancient Iranian revivalism, dedicated to resurrecting the glory of the Achaemenids and stamping out every trace of foreign influence, especially in the strategically vital, culturally complex region of Armenia. The Sasanian kings, the Shahan Shahs, looked at Greater Armenia not as a buffer state, but as a runaway province that needed to be violently brought back into the fold of the Avesta and the purified faith of Zoroaster. They saw the Armenian Arshakuni kings as weak traders, contaminated by too much Hellenistic and Roman influence, and they demanded nothing less than absolute spiritual and political assimilation. This spiritual arrogance was far more dangerous than any mere military invasion, because it sought to erase the Armenian identity itself, forcing it into a homogenized Iranian mold.
The tension became a burning wire across the globe's belly. The Romans, eternally pragmatic, saw the Sasanians as the first genuine existential threat since Carthage. And Armenia, the ultimate fortress, was the only thing standing between the Eastern Roman provinces and complete geopolitical chaos. If Armenia fell, the entire Roman East, Syria, Cappadocia, Asia Minor, was vulnerable to the tidal wave of Sasanian cavalry.
And onto this stage of fire and blood stepped a man whose life would define the next 1,000 years of Armenian destiny, Tredat III. Born into exile, fleeing the murderous chaos of Sasanian aggression, he was raised in the iron discipline of the Roman military machine, educated in Greek philosophy, yet still possessing the untamed mountain heart of an Armenian king.
He was Rome's champion, the ultimate pawn, placed on the throne to act as a living, breathing shield against the Persian tide. But the crown he inherited was made of thorns and soaked in the blood of his ancestors, requiring a constant, brutal balancing act between two titans who wished him dead or compliant, never allowing him a single night of undisturbed sleep.
Tredat's early reign was a magnificent, exhausting saga of relentless warfare. He fought the Persians in massive, bloody campaigns across the high plateaus, winning legendary victories, pushing back the Sasanian tide through sheer force of will and the incredible resilience of the Naxarar cavalry, the elite noble horsemen who were the backbone of the Armenian military structure.
These nobles, holding vast ancestral lands, were simultaneously the king's greatest strength and his most persistent political headache. They answered the call to arms with terrifying loyalty when the Persians crossed the border. Yet they constantly maneuvered against the central authority of the throne, ensuring the kingdom remained decentralized and prone to internal feuds.
Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz, an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yaghi-Siyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties. The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind. A guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.